Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Textual Criticism and the Quran Manuscripts by Keith E. Small. We'll be reading a section, the chapter on the conclusion from the book. It's a really well put together scholarly book, well documented. If you want to be up to date on the textual criticism of the Quran manuscripts and learn from the scholars themselves, then stay tuned. Page 161. Evaluating textual variants is often not a straightforward proposition. This research has examined a wide spectrum of textual variants and shifted them carefully to determine their significance for the transmission of the text of the Quran. In this chapter, we will present a survey of the textual history of the Quran informed by this research. We'll revisit some of the key issues raised in the course of this research and present some implications that follow for the Quran studies. The survey will take form of a summary account of the textual history of the Quran divided into 6 periods with descriptive comments for each period. In the introduction to this book, a basic question was raised as to if and how a critical text of the Quran could be constructed. This would involve the application of methods of textual criticism that have developed in other literary disciplines over the last 2 centuries. The basic goal of this kind of textual criticism, as applied to ancient manuscripts, has been generally defined as 1. To recover the original text, and 2. To trace the historical development of the text. This book is an exercise in the application of textual criticism to early Quran manuscripts to pursue these 2 goals. For considering these goals with precision, a scheme was borrowed and adapted from New Testament studies for describing different levels of textual development in a written literary tradition. The scheme was as follows. 1. The predecessor text form, which is the oral or written source the author used. 2. Autographic text form, which is the form the author wrote as it left his desk. 3. The authoritative text form, which is a form of text that acquired a degree of local consensual authority. 4. Canonical text form, which is a form of the text that acquired a degree of wide consensual authority. And 5. Interpretative text form, any latter intentional reformation of the stylistic, practical, and dogmatic reasons. Now, to summarize how the application of these categories in this book informs the history of the text of the Quran, a survey of the history of the text will be presented in 6 chronological periods. The first 2 categories above are discussed in period 1. The other 3 are used in periods 2 through 6. A chart of these periods featuring particular text features for each period will follow at the end of this section. Okay, next section, titled A History of the Quran's Development Informed by Manuscript Studies. We'll be examining Period 1, Muhammad's Prophetic Career, from 610 to 632 AD. The Quran text was produced in a culture that, while there were forms of writing adequate for business and administrative functions, religious and cultural literatures were kept according to mainly oral conventions. There was evidently in the 7th century still a culture where poetic and religious oral literatures were being created and performed. Literatures not necessarily tied to written text, but related flexibly to bodies of oral stories and some written text circulating in Arabia in those times. The Quran texts were written in a script conveying imprecise grammatical and syntactical meanings and phonetics, functioning more as an aid to memory in reciting already known text than as a vehicle for recording and preserving written literature. This is the period containing the very beginnings of the Quran's existence during the lifetime of Muhammad. It consists of what Muhammad claimed to be received as revelation, and whatever oral or written materials came to be used as authoritative religious texts. There is a lively scholarly debate as to the relative importance of the oral and written in the transmission of religious knowledge, as well as what form an quote, original unquote, text of the Quran could have taken. Donner helpfully discusses these issues and distinguishes between a closed text, which was one marked by a defined content, and an open text, which may have been a somewhat defined core of material supplemented by flexible additions or omissions. Now, some scholars hypothesize that there was an established Christian Arabic literature. However, there is more consensus that there was not an established Arabic written religious literature, and that the actual writings down of material believed to be revelation seems to have been of secondary importance to the oral, in that it was done in a variety of materials, and apparently not kept in a systematic manner. Arabic grammar was not codified until the 8th century, and the Quran is commonly regarded as the first real work of written literature in Arabic, which propelled the codification of Arabic grammar, as well as improved the Arabic orthography. Though it is universally held that there was a strong oral tradition from the outset because of the oral literature culture, it was not thorough enough to establish a precise vocalization of the written text, nor to completely contain variation to the written text. Scholar has correctly observed that because of this situation, it is impossible to know how the Quran was read during the lifetime of Muhammad. Unfortunately, there are difficulties recovering the forms of the text in use during the period because none of the original material has survived. Also, because of the nature of the efforts after Muhammad's death to establish a uniform text, access to any such materials was prevented by their destruction and neglect. Though Quranic material was used under Muhammad's authority within his lifetime, there does not seem to have been one written form of the text in use in his lifetime. Instead, individuals used collections of Quranic material that were able to obtain for themselves. Because of this situation, if one uses EPS categories, one can suggest a blending between the predecessor text forms and the autographic text forms for this earlier period. The autographic material used within Muhammad's lifetime preceded authoritative versions. This was an authoritative body of material, but varying collections of it seem to have been in use within Muhammad's lifetime. This situation continued after his death, and it was in the years immediately following his death that defined authoritative bodies of Quran material came into use. In this sense, the Quran could be said to have multiple original texts, each with both distinct and overlapping content in relation to the others. Rezvan states succinctly, quote, "Since we know that from the beginning there were several versions of the text related to different traditions or transmissions, we should not reduce all of them to one. Strictly speaking, from the time of the prophets, there was no one stetma of the Quranic text." Unquote. The most important sources needed, which are not possible to obtain, are primary source materials from the earliest periods of the collection of the Quran from within the lifetime of Muhammad, and what was collected in writing after his death. Even if these kinds of materials were available, one should not speak of recovering the one original text of the Quran, but instead original text of the Quran, or recovering some of the loose body of original material developed from Muhammad to his companions in its original forms. For the Quran, the earliest stage of text available for reconstruction is an early edited canonical text form from period 3 listed below. Okay, I'm going to stop here for the moment. Bear with me. We'll get through this. Next, we're going to be going through the 6 periods of the Quran manuscripts.